My jealous brother betrayed Maine by sleeping with my fiancée after our engagement, so I exposed them to the entire family and cut them out of my life. It was a moment I dreamed of my entire life. Standing under the fairy lights in the garden, her eyes shimmering like the stars above, I asked Emily to be my wife. The joy in her yes echoed through the crisp evening air, and I felt invincible, as if nothing could go wrong. My parents were thrilled. And even my older brother, Jason, who often seemed to view me as competition, offered a warm smile and congratulated us both. Everything felt perfect, or so I thought. As the night progressed, I noticed Jason hovering around Emily more than usual. He made jokes at my expense, which wasn't uncommon, but his charm seemed excessive this time. Emily, ever polite, laughed along but kept glancing back at me, her face tinged with unease. I brushed it off, assuming Jason was just being his usual overly charismatic self, trying to steal a little of the spotlight. It wouldn't be the first time. The engagement party wrapped up with promises of family dinners and wedding planning. I kissed Emily goodnight and felt the warm satisfaction of a milestone achieved. Little did I know, Jason's congratulatory grin masked something far more sinister. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emily began acting distant, claiming work was stressing her out. Jason, on the other hand, seemed oddly interested in the wedding details, frequently texting Emily with helpful suggestions about venues and themes. One evening, I found Emily sitting on the couch, her phone screen lighting up with Jason's name. When I asked about it, she stammered, saying he was only trying to be helpful. I didn't push the issue, but my gut churned with doubt. Jason had always been competitive, but this level of involvement was unusual, even for him. Determined not to let paranoia ruin my happiness, I focused on the wedding plans and our future. But every time Jason showed up unannounced or found an excuse to talk to Emily alone, the seeds of suspicion grew a little deeper. It was a Friday night when the truth came crashing down. Emily had gone to meet some friends. Or so she claimed. I was scrolling through my phone when a message from a mutual friend popped up. "Hey, I thought you should know I saw Emily with Jason at that new bar downtown." My heart sank as I processed the words. I immediately called Emily, but she didn't answer. I texted Jason and received a casual reply, "What's up, little bro?" The nonchalance of it all enraged me. I decided to drive to the bar, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When I arrived, I saw them in a corner booth, their heads close together. Emily looked guilty, her face pale when she noticed me. Jason, however, smirked, as if daring me to confront them. It was at that moment I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. The betrayal was real, and it cut deeper than I could have imagined. I stormed into the bar, my heart pounding with anger and disbelief. As I approached their table, Emily shot up from her seat, her hands trembling. Jason, on the other hand, leaned back with an infuriatingly smug expression, sipping his drink like he had no care in the world. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. Emily stammered, trying to explain, but her words faltered. Jason shrugged, his nonchalance only fueling my fury. "Relax, bro. We were just talking," he said, but the look in his eyes betrayed his words. I turned to Emily, waiting for her to refute him, to reassure me that this wasn't what it looked like. But she remained silent, tears streaming down her face. That silence was louder than any confession. Without another word, I left the bar, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on my chest like a stone. The next morning I woke up to a dozen missed calls from both Emily and Jason. I ignored them all and went straight to my parents' house. If they thought they could do this behind my back, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I sat down with my mom and dad, recounting everything I'd seen and felt. My mother's face paled as I described Jason's behavior, while my father clenched his jaw in silent anger. They'd always known Jason had a competitive streak, but this was a new low, even for him. Before I could finish, Jason walked in, as if he owned the place. "So, you're running to mom and dad now," he sneered. My father stood up, his voice booming as he demanded Jason explain himself. Jason's cocky demeanor faltered for a moment before he tried to brush it off. "It's not a big deal," he said. But the fury in my father's eyes made it clear he wasn't buying it. Later that day, Emily showed up at my apartment, tears streaming down her face. She begged me to let her explain, but I was too hurt to care. "What is there to explain?" I snapped. "You hooked up with my brother behind my back." She admitted that things had gone too far but claimed she'd been confused and overwhelmed by the engagement. Jason was just there for me, she said, as if that justified her actions. Her words felt like knives, twisting the wound even deeper. When I asked if she loved him, her silence was deafening. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. That was all the answer I needed. I told her to leave and not to come back. Whatever we'd had was over, and there was no salvaging it. Word spread quickly through the family. My cousins, aunts and uncles were all appalled by Jason's actions. Some tried to mediate, insisting that family comes first, but I wasn't interested in forgiveness. Jason had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My parents were devastated, torn between their two sons. They tried to reason with Jason, but he remained unapologetic. It's not like they were married yet, he argued, as if that made it any less of a betrayal. My father's disappointment was palpable, and my mother couldn't even look at him without tearing up. As for Emily, she became a pariah almost overnight. Our mutual friends sided with me, cutting her out of their lives. She tried to reach out a few times, but her messages went unanswered. The life we'd planned together was shattered, and all that was left was the rubble of what once was. The family dinners became a battlefield. My parents tried to keep things civil, but the tension was unbearable. Jason would show up with his usual arrogance, acting like nothing had happened, while I barely spoke a word. Everyone else walked on eggshells, unsure of how to navigate the situation. One evening, my uncle finally broke the silence. "Jason, don't you think you owe your brother an apology?" he said, his voice firm. Jason scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "For what? Falling for someone who clearly wasn't happy with him." That was the last straw. I slammed my fist on the table, my voice trembling with anger. "You didn't fall for her, Jason. You just couldn't stand to see me happy." My mother began to cry, and my father ordered Jason to leave. It was clear the family wasn't going to recover from this easily, if at all. A few weeks later, the truth about Jason's intentions began to surface. My cousin Sarah, who had always been close to Jason, confided in me about a conversation she'd overheard. He admitted to someone that he didn't even care about Emily, she said. He just wanted to prove he could have her. The revelation was a bitter pill to swallow. I had always known Jason to be competitive, but this was a level of cruelty I hadn't expected. He had destroyed my relationship and fractured our family, all for the sake of his ego. I shared this with my parents, and my father's face darkened with anger. My mother, however, seemed more heartbroken than anything. "I don't understand where we went wrong," she whispered, but no amount of soul-searching could undo the damage Jason had caused. After months of trying to mend things, I made a decision it was time to cut Jason out of my life completely. I informed my parents that I wouldn't attend any family gatherings where he was present. "I can't heal if I keep seeing him," I explained. They were reluctant but eventually agreed to respect my boundaries. The next step was more difficult, addressing Jason directly. I sent him a message, short and to the point. "You're no longer my brother. Don't contact me again." His reply was predictably dismissive, mocking me for being too sensitive. But I didn't care anymore. With Jason out of my life, I felt a strange sense of relief. The wound was still fresh, but at least now I could focus on healing without his shadow looming over me. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. Emily wasn't done trying to fix things. She showed up unannounced one afternoon, clutching a handwritten letter. "Please, just read it," she pleaded. Against my better judgment, I took it and let her leave without saying a word. The letter was an emotional mess. She apologized profusely, admitting that she'd let herself get swept up in Jason's charm. "I didn't know how to stop once it started," she wrote. "But I never stopped loving you." The words felt hollow, like an echo of the trust we once had. I didn't reply. Whatever feelings I had for her were buried beneath layers of betrayal and anger. Her apology might have been genuine, but it was far too late to make a difference. Months passed, and while I tried to move on, Jason's behavior continued to haunt the family. At one point I heard through a cousin that Jason had moved on to another woman, one who also happened to be the fiancée of one of his colleagues. It was as if Jason thrived on the chaos and destruction he left in his wake. The family was horrified, but Jason didn't seem to care. "Why should I settle for less?" he reportedly told someone when asked why he pursued engaged women. His arrogance and lack of remorse only solidified my decision to keep him out of my life permanently. My parents, meanwhile, began distancing themselves from Jason too. My father had always been a man of principle, and Jason's blatant disregard for loyalty and family values was too much for him to bear. My mother, though heartbroken, followed suit, and Jason's once solid place in the family began to crumble. The betrayal had left deep scars, and I knew I couldn't move forward without addressing them. I started seeing a therapist, someone who helped me unpack the layers of pain, anger, and self-doubt that had built up over the months. In one session, my therapist asked, "What do you want your life to look like without Jason and Emily?" And the question caught me off guard. I had spent so much time dwelling on what I'd lost that I hadn't considered what I could gain. Slowly, I began to focus on rebuilding myself, my confidence, my relationships, and my goals. It wasn't easy, but each step felt like progress. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from during my engagement, threw myself into work, and even started pursuing hobbies I'd neglected, like hiking and photography. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself again. Arson's continued antics created a rift in the family that grew wider with each passing month. Some relatives, particularly those who had always admired Jason's charm and success, still defended him. "He's just going through a phase," one aunt said dismissively. Others, however, stood firmly on my side, appalled by his actions. Family gatherings became smaller and more selective. My parents stopped inviting Jason altogether, choosing instead to spend time with me and the relatives who supported us. It was bittersweet. I missed the large family get-togethers we once had. But I couldn't deny that the smaller, more intimate gatherings felt more genuine. The split was hardest on my parents, who had always prided themselves on keeping the family united. My mother often said, "I never imagined my sons would end up like this," and the sadness in her voice was palpable. But even she began to accept that Jason's presence did more harm than good. Emily eventually faded from my life, but not entirely. Mutual friends occasionally mentioned her, and I learned through the grapevine that she had moved to another city and started over. She was working at a new job, living in a small apartment, and according to one friend, trying to figure out who she is. Part of me was relieved to hear she was moving on, but another part of me couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. Despite everything, there had been a time when I loved her deeply, and it was hard to reconcile that with the person who had betrayed me. I thought about reaching out once, just to say I forgave her and wish her well, but my therapist advised against it. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconnecting, she said, and she was right. Forgiving Emily wasn't about her, it was about freeing myself from the weight of the past. As I focused on rebuilding my life, opportunities I hadn't considered before began to emerge. I was offered a promotion at work, which came with the chance to relocate to a different city. It felt like the fresh start I desperately needed. Moving wasn't easy. I had to leave behind the comfort of familiarity and the support of family and friends who had stood by me through the betrayal. But as I unpacked in my new apartment, overlooking the bustling streets of a city I barely knew, I felt a renewed sense of hope. This was my chance to redefine myself, free from the shadows of Jason and Emily. I started exploring the city, making new friends, and even joined a hiking group. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The scars from the past were still there, but they no longer defined me. Back home, Jason's actions were catching up to him. The woman he'd been seeing, his colleague's fiancée, had exposed him after their affair ended disastrously. Word spread quickly through his workplace, and Jason's reputation took a massive hit. He was eventually forced to resign, and the family's golden boy was left scrambling for damage control. My father, who had tried to remain neutral for so long, finally confronted Jason. "Your actions have consequences," he told him, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You can't keep hurting people and expect us to keep bailing you out." Jason's downfall brought a strange sense of vindication. It wasn't that I wanted him to fail, but seeing him finally face the repercussions of his behavior felt like justice. For the first time, Jason had to deal with the reality he had created, and no one was rushing to save him. One evening, during a casual meetup with my hiking group, I met someone who caught me off guard. Her name was Rachel, and she had an infectious energy that made everyone around her feel at ease. We bonded over our shared love of the outdoors, and before I knew it, we were spending more and more time together. Rachel was different from Emily in every way. She was honest, kind, and had a way of making me laugh even on my worst days. But more importantly, she didn't just accept my past, she helped me see that it didn't define my future. As our relationship grew, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't thought possible. With Rachel, there were no games, no secrets, and no betrayals. It was a kind of love I hadn't known before, and it gave me hope that true happiness was still within reach. One day, out of the blue, Jason reached out to me. His message was short and uncharacteristically humble. "Can we talk against my better judgment?" I agreed to meet him at a cafe. When I arrived, I barely recognized him. The confident, cocky older brother I'd grown up with looked defeated. He admitted that he had hit rock bottom, and that losing the family's trust had been a wake-up call. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice trembling. It was the first time I'd ever seen Jason show genuine remorse. But I wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. I told him that while I appreciated his apology, trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. "If you're serious about changing, prove it," I said. and with that, I walked away. Word of Jason's apology spread through the family, and slowly, the rift began to heal. My parents were cautiously optimistic, but they respected my boundaries, giving me the space to decide how much of a relationship I wanted with Jason. Jason started attending therapy, and his behavior began to change. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was an effort I hadn't seen before. He even reached out to Emily, apologizing for the pain he'd caused her as well. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Meanwhile, I continued focusing on my own life. The family dynamic would never be the same, but I was learning to accept that. Some wounds leave scars, but scars are a sign of healing, not defeat. Jason's efforts to change became more evident over time. He started volunteering at a local youth mentorship program, something that seemed completely out of character for the Jason I once knew. My parents kept me updated, cautiously hopeful about his progress. One day he sent me another message, asking if we could meet again. I hesitated but eventually agreed. This time the tone was different. Jason apologized again, but this time he didn't ask for forgiveness, he just wanted to own his mistakes. "I don't expect us to go back to how things were," he said. "I just want you to know I'm trying to be better." His words felt sincere, and while I wasn't ready to fully reconcile, I told him I appreciated the effort. It was a small step, but it felt significant. Maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward for us, though it wouldn't be easy. Rachel had become a significant part of my life, and I felt it was time for her to meet my family. I was nervous, given the recent turmoil, but she reassured me with her usual warmth and confidence. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it together," she said, squeezing my hand. The meeting went better than I could have hoped. My parents adored Rachel, and she fit in seamlessly with the family. Even Jason, who had been invited to the dinner as a show of progress, kept things civil. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic gatherings of the past year, and for the first time in a long time I felt a sense of peace. Rachel's presence was a reminder of how far I'd come. She wasn't just my partner, she was my anchor, helping me navigate the stormy waters of family and personal growth. Jason's journey toward redemption wasn't without its setbacks, but he continued to put in the work. He stayed in therapy, mended relationships with extended family, and even reached out to former colleagues to make amends. Slowly but surely he was rebuilding his life. One day he surprised me with an unexpected gesture. He handed me a letter he'd written, detailing his regrets and acknowledging the pain he'd caused. "I know I can never undo what I did," he wrote, "but I'm committed to becoming someone you can be proud to call your brother again." Reading those words brought tears to my eyes. It didn't erase the past, but it showed me that Jason was genuinely trying. For the first time I began to believe that reconciliation was possible, not immediately, but someday. As the months turned into a year, life began to feel normal again, though a new kind of normal. Jason and I weren't close, but we were on speaking terms, and our interactions were no longer charged with anger or resentment. It was a tentative truce, built on mutual effort, and a shared desire to move forward. Rachel and I grew closer, and I began to see a future with her. She supported me through every step of my healing journey, and I knew I wanted to build a life with her. When I proposed during a weekend getaway in the mountains, she said yes, her eyes shining with tears of joy. For the first time in years, I felt like I had everything I needed: love, hope, and a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer defined me. My wedding day was a milestone, not just for me, but for the entire family. Jason was there, not as my best man, that honor went to my cousin, but as a brother who had worked hard to earn back a place in my life. During his toast at the reception, Jason stood and addressed the room. "I'm not proud of the person I was," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm proud of the person I'm becoming, and that's because of the love and patience this family has shown me even when I didn't deserve it." His words were met with applause, but more importantly, they were met with forgiveness. In that moment I realized that while the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, they had become part of a larger story, one of growth, resilience, and reconciliation. As Rachel and I danced under the soft glow of fairy lights, surrounded by family and friends, I felt a sense of closure. The journey had been painful and messy, but it had also led me to this moment, and for that I was grateful.